Welcome to A Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm your host, Ben Plumley, and this is a podcast about global health and human rights. It's produced in partnership with the Bay Area Global Health Alliance, which is a group of companies from the tech and biotech and other sectors, as well as academic institutions and non-profits, all committed to improving the healthcare of people around the world. You can find out more about them at their website, www.bayareaglobalhealth.org. Well, in this episode, I am honoured to be meeting Dr. Kimberly Smith, who is the head of research and development at ViiV Healthcare. Dr. Smith, welcome to A Shot in the Arm podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, dive right in. You're a physician by training, yes? You were trained and born in Michigan?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, yes, and I went to the University of Michigan for all of my schooling.
What got you interested in medicine?
You know, from the time I was a child, I was curious about medicine. I was the kid that when you went fishing, I would dissect the frog and dissect the fish, and I needed to, understand it. And so, I can't even think of one particular thing that drew me to medicine, but I guess I always had that sort of, how can I help people? And, I just loved biology. And so all of those things, came together to lead me to medicine. There was no family connection. No one in my family was a physician or anything like that.
And then you went on to practice medicine in Chicago, and would be really keen to know what your experience was like working in such a fast-paced and diverse community.
Well, that's all I'd really ever known, having grown up in Detroit. Chicago was obviously a big city, big urban city, many of the typical urban challenges. But I was a political person from the time that I was in college. And, I wanted to be in a setting where I would be impacting, communities that I connected to. And so that's primarily the African-American community.
And then in 2013, you joined ViiV Healthcare, and really interested to know what your thoughts were about coming over to join the pharmaceutical industry.
I spent 20 years in Chicago with my training and really focused on HIV and ultimately as doing HIV research. And so that was my passion. And ViiV was a unique opportunity. It was very different than any other pharmaceutical company because it was uniquely focused on HIV. The head of R&D at the time, John Pottage, was a longtime mentor and friend. And, he basically sort of knocked on my door. We talked about it. And even though I'd never imagined myself going into industry, when I talked to John about it, I trusted him enough that, I believed that there was an opportunity for me to do something, make the next step in my career and impact people in a different way. And so it's all history from there.
Well, of course, I have a similar history in that I did the same thing, I guess, about, 25 years ago, having been an advocate and activist at the UK Terence Higgins Trust, I came on over to a predecessor of ViiV, Glaxo Wellcome, and always felt that it was, we're all in this together, and we all have different things to contribute, but ultimately, particularly with HIV, we're fighting a unique threat to human society and security, and I just felt that it was an opportunity to do something different. Well, here we are at AIDS 2020, virtual AIDS 2020. Not at all what we imagined we were going to be doing.
Not at all. No, I think we were all looking forward to, the Oakland and San Francisco, connection and really doing something very unique. And so this is a challenge and a disappointment.
Yeah, it is a disappointment. I'm on the board of the California Prostitutes Education Project in Oakland, which is one of the sort of premier HIV testers in the East Bay. And we had such a program lined up to shine a light on the HIV response, both the challenges and the opportunities for the African American community, for marginalized communities. And so it's a real challenge to have to do that virtually. Do you have any thoughts on how we can continue to do this and sort of essentially build a legacy of keeping that light shining on the needs of that community?
Well, I think when we start talking about getting to the end of AIDS, in order to get to the end of AIDS, we have to identify all of the communities that are disproportionately impacted. And we have to find ways to get into those communities and connect with them, have them trust us, have them, bring us into the fold so that, we can, when we create new technologies, that we can bring those along and people be trusted to accept them. And so if those relationships are so critical. And so it is disappointing that you don't get to showcase some of the work that has been done to create those relationships with those communities. And
you talked about new technologies, and that's really where I wanted to go next with this. ViiV has some fascinating research, particularly in long-acting injectable prevention and treatment. And today you guys released some interesting new data on pre-exposure prophylaxis with long-acting. Can you tell us what that was?
Well, so the data came from the HPTN, or HIV Prevention Trials Network, 083 study. And this study was designed to compare long-acting cabotegravir, which is an integrase inhibitor, to what is the standard of care, oral daily Truvada. And so this study was started in 2016 after many years of planning. And it was anticipated that this study would go on probably as long as 2 or more years. But the study was stopped early by a DSMB, a Data Safety and Monitoring Committee, because in their first interim review of the data, they saw a very dramatic difference in the efficacy and in the effectiveness of the long-acting cabotegravir in comparison to Truvada. There were 3 times as many HIV events occurring in the Truvada arm in comparison to the cabotegravir arm. And so that was actually quite dramatic. And the DSMB thought that it was important enough, convincing enough that this was information that the field needed to see, and that individuals that were randomized to the Truvada arm should be offered the opportunity to receive cabotegravir. And so, that happened it's now a little over a month ago in mid-May. And, it was we were extremely thrilled with the data because, we need more treatments or we need more prevention options. And this study was really particularly important for a lot of reasons. One, it was a large study, 4,600 men who have sex with men and transgendered women. But it was particularly important because we made a point from the beginning of enrolling populations most disproportionately impacted. And so that means in the US, Black men who have sex with men, particularly young Black men who have sex with men, and globally young men who have sex with men, so under 30, even under 25, and then transgendered women who are disproportionately impacted by HIV. And so the study did a great job of enrolling them with basically 50% of the U.S. enrollment being in Black MSM. The overall study had about 2/3 were under 30, and there was 12% transgendered women. And so we had this will be the largest interventional study of transgendered women. It'll be the largest ever interventional study of Black men who have sex with men. And so to show this great efficacy in a study that really does represent the population's most impacted was really the most thrilling part.
And and an obvious thing to state that with such a high proportion of African American men who have sex with men, that's going to have a huge impact in terms of acceptability of the data. But just to unpack what you've said, so the injectable not only showed non-inferiority, it actually showed superiority over a regimen that is generally considered to be, pretty damn effective.
That's right. That's right.
That's really terrific. So an obvious question then, looking at the approval of Descovy at the end of last year, and of course Descovy is the new oral formulation of tenofovir plus FTC for use in PrEP. The FDA approved that really only for use in men, and I think the language was for people without uteruses. So what is ViiV's strategy to make sure that the long-acting injectable can be quickly and readily available for girls and women?
Right. So yes, Descovy was approved to quote the indication specifically for people who, for everyone except those who have receptive vaginal intercourse, which, that's kind of a mouthful to say that over and over, but ultimately it essentially, cisgendered women were not studied, and thus Descovy is not indicated for them at this point. The company needs to do some additional work to try to get there. For us from the beginning, we intended that we would answer this question with long-acting cabotegravir for both transgendered women, men who have sex with men, and cisgendered women. And so in addition to the 083 study, we have a study called the 084 study, which is a study that is similarly designed, comparing long-acting cabotegravir to oral Truvada dosed daily, both of them double-blind, double-dummy. But this is focused on women in sub-Saharan Africa. And so this is a study that is basically, will have 3,200 women randomized 1-to-1 to either of the arms. So that study, while we conceived of the two studies at around the same time, that study got started a little bit later, just really a number of challenges with regulatory agencies and just design of the study that meant that study actually started enrollment roughly a year after the 084 study and 083 study, sorry. And so we don't have as much follow-up with the 084 study. It's not completely enrolled. It still is about 200 women short of full enrollment. And so we don't have that answer yet, but we will, most importantly. And I think that's the critical part. We're not going to be in a situation where we can't answer the question for women because we didn't bother to study them.
I think that is a really important and welcome clarification, Kimberly. So, so kudos to you and your R&D team for doing that. One of the other questions that I know came up would be around the interactions with FDA over the cabotegravir injectable, and that there were issues, I think, at the end of last year over, I think, some of the manufacturing of the long-acting. Where do we stand with that now?
So in addition to looking at cabotegravir as an option for prevention, we are looking at it as an option for treatment in combination with long-acting rilpivirine. And we filed that in April of 2019. And the expectation was that at the end of last year, we would get FDA approval. Unfortunately, we did not get FDA approval because they had some concerns about the manufacturing process and the controls that we have on the manufacturing process. And so we got something called a complete response letter. And so that means basically that we have some additional work to do to reassure the agency with regard to our full manufacturing process and controls. And so we're doing that. We plan to refile with the FDA within a few weeks. And so we hope to get that back on track. And so, there was never an issue with the safety of the product. It was just demonstrating to them, to their satisfaction, that we had full control of the manufacturing process.
And that sort of leads us on to treatment. And ViiV has been at the forefront of exploring dual combination regimens for treatment. Do you have any data being presented around your treatment strategies, and particularly a drug very close to my heart, dolutegravir? Anything that we should be aware of at AIDS 2020?
There's some information at AIDS 2020. We have some follow-up data from the Tango study. So you may remember that was a study looking at Dovato, which is our combination of dolutegravir and lamivudine, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's been around for a very long time. And so we combined dolutegravir and lamivudine into a 2-drug regimen called Dovato. And the Tango study took individuals who are on a TAF-based regimen and randomized them to staying on that regimen versus switching to Dovato. And so we presented that data last year and showed that it worked extremely well. There were no individuals who had virologic failure on Dovato. And so this year, what we're showing is actually a metabolic analysis where we're looking at were there benefits for individuals who, change from that TAF-based regimen to Dovato. And so some of the details will show that there were improvements in cholesterol, there were improvements in insulin resistance. And so there's a lot more detail there. But that's one of the exciting things to share at this meeting, because I do think, you're right. We have led the way when it comes to 2-drug regimens. And, we want to be able to demonstrate to people that the benefit of 2-drug regimens is, tangible, that there's not just that you're going from 3 drugs to 2, it's that taking away a drug makes a difference. And if you can get rid of some of the adverse events, particularly in the long term, hopefully that will lead to really just better outcomes overall for people.
And that's really where the discussion is. In a sense, there's something almost, and you're going to kill me for saying this, something sort of mystical about the golden triangle of 3 drug treatments. You feel, oh, that's we can. There's going to be no problem of whack-a-mole with the virus if we have 3 drugs. That we're going to be certain of suppression, and you do hear that from doctors as well. So how do you go about sort of explaining the balance that once you've got someone down to undetectable, it's the long-term suppression that really matters, and how a dual sort of fits into that?
Well, so how we got to 3-drug regimens being the mantra is sort of, when you think about it, we started out with what did we used the best things that we had. But in comparison to the drugs that we have now, they were relatively weak in their potency. And so you did need to combine 3 of them in order to consistently get suppression. What we have now is better drugs that have better potency, dolutegravir being a perfect example of that. So you don't need 3 drugs to get the same amount of potency. And so I think if we were to start designing this from the beginning with everything that we have now, we probably wouldn't have gotten to 3 drugs. We would have stopped at 2 because we would have gotten what we needed with 2. And so, when you have to kind of understand the evolution of, HIV treatment, and sort of 3 drugs became the mantra because that's when we first demonstrated consistent success, when we put 3 of them together. But again, they were weaker drugs. And so now I think we have to rethink, start with what we've got now and say, how do you build a regimen? You build a regimen with it. You start with 1 drug that is very, very strong, and then you add a companion drug in order to minimize the risk that you select for resistance. And that's what we've been able to do with our 2-drug regimens. And, we're happy about the success of it. But I think what it has demonstrated to the field now is that, that mantra that it required 3 drugs is no longer the case. And I think that, other companies, arguably competitors have caught on to that as well. And now they're looking at modern day potent medications and putting 2 together instead of 3. And so, I think that the success we've had with Juluca and Dovato and now with the long-acting 2-drug regimen, I think is ultimately changing the field.
So turning to the future now, how do you see the HIV field playing out over the next decade or so? And I suppose the sort of balance between the need for research into new, more effective regimens, but also regimens that actually meet, are accessed and are accepted by communities most in need.
Well, I think the long-acting regimens are really going to revolutionize HIV treatment. I think people are going to get to a place where the expectation that you have to take a pill every day is going to be sort of old news. We're obviously starting that evolution with our long-acting regimen. Other companies are following with long-acting regimens. So I think the future is to try to improve the convenience of HIV treatment. People want to live their lives normally. They want to be able to travel. They want to be able to do everything that they could do if they weren't living with HIV and not have to worry about carrying a pill with them and potentially the stigma associated with carrying a pill with them. So I think long acting therapy is the wave of the future. But I also think that we will continue to aggressively look for a cure. Ultimately, that's the goal. We need to get to not just less frequent, not just less, more tolerable. Ultimately, we want to get to a point where individuals who are living with HIV can actually be able to say that they're cured. And of course, on top of that, again, when you start talking about getting to the end of the epidemic, you also have to stem the tide of new infections. So we've got to improve prevention. So we need a way to cure folks, at least if not a sterilizing cure, a functional cure, so that individuals can be treated with something. And although they you may not be able to completely eliminate the virus from their body, you can at least contain it in a way that they don't need to take medicines every day. So, I think that's the future. And all of the companies are committed to that. I think, we sometimes say that our goal is to put ourselves out of business. And we do mean that ultimately. We want to get to a cure. And, nothing could be more gratifying as a person who was fascinated by HIV from the first time I began to learn about it, who, was an HIV treater for 20 years and saw all of the difficulties and pain that people living with HIV have experienced. Nothing could be more gratifying than to actually see us get to that day.
And an interview with a senior executive from ViiV would not be complete. And there are thousands of people who truly would kill me if I didn't ask this. What's the future for Positive Action, the community support program, global community support program that also launched the groundbreaking Southern States Initiative in the United States? How do you see that playing into the strategy for the next decade?
Well, Positive Action isn't going anywhere. It continues to be really one of the pillars of ViiV Healthcare. And we've recently just actually revitalized it with some new leadership, some new people coming to be involved in it, to increase focus on some of the communities most hardest hit, including young men who have sex with men, women of color, young women all over the world. And so Positive Action is here to stay. The efforts are historic. It's been around for so long. And, having been involved in it very early on, it's done so many things. And so the Global Village, for example, that is a part of the International AIDS Conference, every year, Positive Action is basically a key part of that. And so, we are super proud to be associated with Positive Action. And so you can be sure it's not going anywhere.
That's great to hear. Well, we're living in some very, very curious times, Kimberly. And I suppose the first of those curious times is the COVID-19 pandemic. As an infectious disease physician, are you surprised at the way in which the American public health system seems to have, sort of crumbled in handling it?
I can say that I'm profoundly disappointed. I can't underscore that enough. To see the numbers that have become infected in the United States, the numbers of individuals that have succumbed to this disease in the United States and around the world, but in particular in the United States, where we have really more cases than anywhere else in the world. And actually to have seen the curve start to improve dramatically and now actually be really completely becoming vertical again is terribly disappointing. And so, I think some things just were not handled well. I think there's not been consistent messaging, which is, that's the first step in any addressing any epidemic. Everyone needs to be, on the same page with regard to how you go about controlling an epidemic. And so I'm disappointed. I'm frustrated. Um, you know, I know individuals that have succumbed to this disease, including brilliant researchers and treaters. So it's just, I mean, it's about as horrible as you can get. And I wish I could say it was moving in the right direction in the United States, but so far, as Anthony Fauci mentioned just recently, the U.S. is going in the wrong direction, and he's obviously very disappointed about that as well.
How have you managed to continue leading a global R&D organization in the midst of this while everyone's been working at home? How has that gone?
Technology helps a lot, obviously. I can say that, the the company has done a great job of making us be able to stay in touch with each other and have meetings like our meeting now, where we can communicate our plans and have a conversation almost as if we're in the same room. Obviously, there are a lot of folks working from home in the shelter in place, but then there's a whole group of folks at ViiV and at GSK who aren't sheltering at home. They're actually going into manufacturing facilities and into labs. And so continuing the work that we do with some social distancing, obviously a little bit of change in protocols, but really dedicated people that really have been going all along, never stopped. And, and for us, we've just put our head down and, kept at the work. We have prioritized making sure we continue to have continuity in our global clinical supply for, commercial supply for people who are on our medicines, but also clinical supplies for clinical trials, making sure that, we backed everything up and made sure that there weren't going to be individuals in our trials who couldn't have access to medicines or had any interruptions. We've had some flexibility where individuals can have their visits instead of having to come into the clinic. They have a visit over the phone, so you've had to be creative, but I'm happy to say that we've really managed to, I think, do a pretty remarkable job in maintaining the continuity of our clinical trials.
And then I guess the other sort of big issue, the moment of reckoning, particularly here in the United States. And I suppose coming from the brutal murder of George Floyd is the Black Lives Matter movement. And I guess it's, ripped off the scab of America's original sin, systemic racism. And I just wondered, in asking you this, here you are, one of the top leaders, global leaders in HIV research and in the pharmaceutical industry. And in this environment, what advice would you give to young African-American girls and boys considering a career in industry and considering a career in clinical research? What advice would you have for them?
Well, that's a great question. My advice is, one, stick to it. You can do it. Find good mentors. Find people who can support you. Many of those mentors could be African Americans who have been successful, like me, but they don't have to be. I've had many mentors in my career who were not Black, who were just folks who wanted to see me be successful. So find a good mentor. But I think that a big part of doing something about giving these young folks these opportunities is having them see that it is possible and know that, there are people who can be successful in these fields. And so the visibility of, people like myself, but many other folks who've come well before me who, just make it clear that it is possible to do this. And, I started talking a little bit about my history, but, I didn't come from a rich background. I grew up in Detroit. I went to public schools. I studied hard, worked hard, and, didn't have a silver spoon all in my, didn't grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth. We can do this, but we do need to have, have that motivation and have that confidence that we can get past these hurdles. What has happened with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement, I think is an important moment, but not just a moment. It has to be a sustained moment in order for it to be a movement where we actually see this change. And in order for that to happen, there has to be a clear, open recognition of the impact of systematic racism. And as long as we continue to deny that it exists or try to minimize it or try to put a Band-Aid over these problems that are massive gaping wounds, we'll never get there. And so my advice to young folks who are looking to move forward and to have careers in medicine and pharmaceuticals is stick to it. Get to your books, focus on that, and look for mentors who can help you to navigate what can be challenging waters. There's nothing special about me. I'm not. I was never, any more brilliant than the next young African American woman in my high school. But I had a family that helped me to stick to my books and encouraged me. And like I said, I found great mentors. And so, you just have to never give up and be committed. And I hope that we will take this moment to focus on creating more opportunities for young African American men and women so that, they can see their lives being valued.
Yeah. And looking at that systematically, both across academic institutions and the industry, to provide a cadre of mentors. I know there are plenty of people who would benefit from that.
Absolutely, and that's a commitment that we're making. I mean, we're the company has sort of stopped in this moment and said, okay, we've been doing some things to try to make sure that we have appropriate representation in the company. But what more can we do? Because clearly what we're doing is not enough. And so, what can we step up? How can we have more senior leaders that are African American and that are people of color? How can we make sure that we're seeing more Black women in some of those leadership positions? And so, our company is doing it. I'm happy to see many companies are doing it. But again, can't be just a moment, has to be sustained, a long-term commitment to making this change.
So just finally, how have you been doing these last couple of months? How do you stay sane?
That makes the assumption that I am sane. It's been a challenging time for so many reasons. Obviously, COVID is emotionally draining, and from a work standpoint, everything that we had on our plates is still there, and then a tremendous amount of additional came on because of COVID. So work has been crazy. And then, when you just watch the news, which I'm probably just a news junkie, which is, part of the insanity. But when you watch the news, it's upsetting and the numbers are upsetting. And you add the Black Lives Matter challenge to that, there's a lot to be upset about. But, I try to look for what's positive. And, when it comes to, again, the point that I made about Black Lives Matter is that what can this trigger? How can this trigger us to see things differently? And we've already seen sort of a change, even when we look in the US at how many people recognize racism, systemic racism, as a problem. That's gone up dramatically. And so I try to look at what are the bright sides of that. And, I would say I don't have as much of an outlet as I should, but when I can, I try to get out and put my hands in the dirt and garden, and that's always, a positive, because you get to see something tangible come out of that, and hopefully something delicious and beautiful come out of that. And so that's my that's my way of sort of taking my mind away from some of the negativity that can be out there.
Well, Dr. Smith, I know that you've got a completely full agenda here at AIDS 2020. Kimberly, I just want to say thank you so much for being on the show. It's been an absolute honor having you here, and just wishing you and your colleagues the very best of luck. And thank you for everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure to be here and have a fun conversation with you and to talk about some of the exciting work that we're going to be sharing at the International AIDS Conference this year. So thank you so much for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Well, that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed the show. Our thanks to Dr. Kimberly Smith. Thanks also to our director and producer, Erica Spera of NewsDoc Media. Thanks also to our production manager, Brian Regas. This episode was recorded during AIDS 2020, and if you are a delegate at that conference, hope you're having a fruitful and productive time. And finally, thanks to you, our listeners and viewers. As always, you can contact us at Shotarm Podcast through YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can download this and all other episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for watching, and don't forget, wear a mask.